Hello, my name is Kurt Clemenson. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Foundation, which is the world's largest network of active environmental teachers and students, working hard to save the rainforests. During the last few years, those students have written thousands of letters and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for rainforest conservation. We're going to be shooting our video on the rainforest today from the Houston Zoo. These facilities act as a Noah's Ark, protecting biodiversity as the rainforests are being destroyed.
The rainforests are found in a belt at the equator that is about 3,000 miles in diameter. Most of us, when we hear the word rainforest, associate the term with the country of Brazil and the Amazon basin in South America. And indeed, this is the world's largest rainforest, comprising about 1/3 of the total rainforests. However, there are about 80 other countries that have tropical rainforests. Connected to South America is Central America and its 7 rainforest countries. This is an area where we do most of our projects with the Nature Conservancy. In Central Africa, there is a large country named Zaire. Zaire is the size of the United States, east of the Mississippi River, and has 10% of the world's rainforest. Unfortunately, Zaire also has had a dictator who's been in power now for over 30 years. He stole so much money out of the country that when the people of Zaire get sick, there's no medicine. When they want to drive a car, there's no gasoline. So you can imagine that someone like that's not going to care very much about the rainforest. Above Australia is the country of Indonesia. Spread over 13,000 islands, Indonesia is the world's 4th largest country in population. Like Zaire, Indonesia also has 10% of the world's rainforest. Unfortunately, it too has a corrupt president who has held power for over 25 years. If you go to Indonesia, you will see the forest being destroyed at an unbelievable rate.
I want to stress that we are not saying that these countries should not use their resources. That's not realistic. However, to turn a beautiful forest into a desert creates more long-term problems than it solves. So today, we're not just going to take a look at how beautiful rainforests are, we're going to see who's responsible for these destructive practices so that we can write letters and try to get them to change their policies. But first, let's take a look at a rainforest.
This rainforest is in the country of Panama. If you were flying overhead in an airplane, it would appear as a giant, multi-hued green carpet spread out for hundreds of miles. Occasionally, though, you would see a tree poking its head out of the forest, headed up to 250 feet tall. We call this one tree the emergent layer. There are usually 1 or 2 of these trees per acre. Oftentimes, there's a predatory bird nesting in the emergent layer. In fact, this tree had a harpy eagle. Harpy eagles are the most powerful eagles in the world. They can stand 3 feet tall, but have shorter wingspans so they can dive into the forest to hunt. Each day, we watched as this eagle would snag a monkey or parrot, someone not paying attention, and they'd turn into a snack. If you go to the zoo and see chimpanzees, macaws, orangutans, in fact, much of the wildlife in the zoo comes from the next layer of the rainforest called the canopy, which stretches from about 100 to 130 feet. Below the canopy is the understory. Stretching from about 50 to 80 feet, the understory contains many shorter trees that can live with less sunlight than canopy or emergent trees. It also has plants on the tree branches called bromeliads, epiphytes, and orchids. Many of the houseplants that are grown in the United States originate in the understory of the rainforest. Finally, way down at the bottom is the forest floor. As you can imagine, walking around in the rainforest and looking up into the canopy for wildlife, you're really not going to see much. For one thing, it's too high. There is also too much vegetation in the way. In the mid-1980s, scientists strung a cable from tree to tree 130 feet above the forest floor. By wearing a harness that attaches to the cable, we can cruise around the canopy much like Sean Connery did in the movie The Medicine Man. This forest fire illustrates the seriousness of the problem. During the past 50 years, man has destroyed 1/2 of the world's rainforests. At the rate that we're going, we'll lose the other half in the next 30 years. Now, we have to be careful when we show these slides that we do not give people so much negative news that they get depressed and go home and plop down in front of the TV so they don't have to think about it. That wouldn't do anyone any good.
And we are starting to win some battles. That forest fire that you just saw was one of about 15,000 major fires raging in the Amazon in 1986. It was so bad that year that when the space shuttle flew over and took photographs, the whole country of Brazil was covered in a smoky haze.
What we did was to encourage people to write thousands of letters to the government of Brazil. Well, letter writing worked. Today, these fires, for the most part, are out. They even use helicopters to monitor this region, and when there's smoke, they go in to investigate. In 1990, they collected $9 million in fines. So there is hope. If we work hard together, we can save much of what remains. This is a picture of one of my favorite countries, Costa Rica. Costa Rica fought a very bad civil war in 1948. Literally everyone knew someone killed in the war. In fact, they were so disgusted with what they'd seen, they decided to never fight again and disbanded the army. The money that they saved not buying guns and bullets, they spent on education, health care, and protecting their environment. In 1951, a group of Quakers living in Alabama heard about this country with no army. Quakers are a religious order. They're also pacifists, and they don't believe in war. So they went to check out Costa Rica and fell in love with an area called Monteverde. Unfortunately, they didn't know anything about tropical agriculture, and they proceeded to cut down much of the rainforest to raise cattle, and today they are one of the largest milk and cheese producers in the country. However, they were also smart enough to leave a small layer of rainforest on this mountain, about 1,000 acres. This is a special type of rainforest called a cloud forest. They knew if they logged it, when it rained, the water would run off the mountain so fast that their wells would run dry. About 20 years ago, we began to hear rumors that the forest was filled with birds. George Powell, head of the Audubon Society at the time, went down and spent a month bird watching and was amazed after 30 days that he had seen more species of birds in that tiny forest than there are in Canada and the United States combined. Costa Rica, the size of the state of Louisiana, has 55 species of hummingbirds. The whole continental United States has only 15, so you can see why we're so concerned about conserving what's there. What you are looking at 20 years ago was a cow pasture. The tree to the side of the screen is almost 150 feet tall and was the last of the rainforest canopy. It had no commercial value, so the Quakers just left it out in their pasture. The World Wildlife Fund acquired the land, removed the cattle, and allowed the rainforest to grow back. Fortunately, this is a very rich volcanic soil, and after just 20 years, the rainforest is already 90 feet tall. Most rainforests do not grow back this quickly, if at all. We do think that it will take another 125 years for this rainforest to mature. Now, during that time, trees battle each other for sunlight. Some don't make it. Others, however, will go on to form part of the new canopy, and when that happens, only about 2 to 20% of the sunlight will penetrate to the forest floor, so that even on a hot, sunny day in the rainforest, it's very dark. As a result, the temperature averages just 75 to 80 degrees year-round. Although the temperature is quite pleasant, they do get a lot of rain, up to 35 feet per year, not 35 inches. When you get that much rain, you wind up with an ecosystem covered with things that grow, like fungus, mushrooms, moss, bacteria. In fact, when you see a leaf fall to the forest floor, it almost disintegrates immediately as the worms and bacteria break it down. The nutrients are recycled back up into the trees, what we call the biomass. In a while, you see why that process is so important. Now, each summer, the Earth Foundation takes students and teachers to the rainforest for eco-education. We provide trips to Costa Rica, Panama, and Belize to observe the great wealth of biodiversity each of these countries is so fortunate to have. Costa Rica is one of our favorite places to take people because the wildlife is beginning to move back in as the forest in many areas has regenerated. In fact, we now see 3 different kinds of monkeys: squirrel, whiteface, and howler monkeys. Howler monkeys are fascinating because they have a hollow jaw that they force air pressure through. Each monkey makes more sound than a pack of dogs. A whole troop of monkeys are often mistaken for the roar of a jaguar. And rainforests are very colorful places. Wherever you stand, you would see flits of color darting in and out of the forest: parrots, macaws, toucans. This area is also home to thousands of different kinds of insects. There are over 100 different varieties of butterflies found in this area. One of them is called a morpho butterfly. Bright iridescent blue, they're almost the size of a frisbee. So you can see rainforests are these unbelievably beautiful and magical places. If you ever get a chance to visit one, do not pass it up.
One last thing, it took the rainforest a long time to evolve. Temperate forests like we have in the United States have been evolving for about 10,000 years, ever since the last ice age. Well, rainforests have been evolving 100 million years. On soil, it's basically like the floor in your classroom, baked hard by the sun, leached of its nutrients by constant rainfall. In fact, if you were to do a science experiment, each student takes some garden seeds and spread them on the classroom floor, water them every day, you might get them to sprout, but obviously you're not going to grow a garden in this classroom.
On the other hand, if you were to take this beautiful bromeliad out of the rainforest, place it on the floor, and water it every day, it would grow. These plants evolved a cup-like shape over millions of years. That cup fills with water and the plant extracts its food right from the water. Some rainforest plants can pull nutrients right from the air and are called epiphytes, which is Greek for air plant. If you have a garden at home, you might recognize this plant. It's a jungle cucumber. Many of the plants of the rainforest are related to what we grow commercially in the United States. Now notice the leaves. If you were to visit a zoo or an arboretum in the United States, they grow rainforest plants, but the leaves are always perfect. The leaves on this plant look like Swiss cheese. That's because if you were to go out into the forest at night and turn a flashlight on the leaves, you'd see insects consuming everything in sight. Bats swoop out of the sky at night to feed on this plant. The white ball at the top is a delicious fruit. When the bat grabs the fruit, he also rubs up against the mustard-colored part called the stamen. He gets a little pollen on his wings and then goes to feed on the next plant. The pollen is knocked off his wings onto that plant, and in a few weeks the plant begins to produce seeds. In the United States, it's the bees that pollinate most of the plants. However, in the rainforest, bats are much more important than bees for pollination. Bats also pass thousands of seeds from the fruit that they eat through their digestive tract. Up to 95% of the plants in the rainforest depend on bats and birds for seed dispersal. Without bats, there would literally be no rainforest. Up to 3 feet wide and approximately 2.2 pounds in weight, this is the world's largest flower called Rafflesia. Found in Southeast Asia, it is pollinated by flies who are attracted to the flower scent and appearance, that of rotted meat. This is an important part of the rainforest called a strangler fig tree. One of hundreds of species of strangler figs, these trees produce hundreds of pounds of fruit year-round. Bats, birds, monkeys, etc. depend on this for food. When birds swallow the fruit and then fly to the top of the trees, they pass seeds through their digestive tract. The seeds get caught in the tree branches, and a flower starts 150 feet up in the air. Appearing like string, the flower roots reach towards the forest floor and surround the host tree. They basically choke the tree as they begin to enlarge. The tree inside of this strangler fig died and rotted away about 75 years ago. So not only is it huge, it's also hollow. And we've found it to be a great place to gather new specimens. Inside this tree, you'd find bats, birds, spiders, snakes, and even cockroaches 3 inches long. This is a leafcutter ant. Often when walking in the rainforest, you'll see fresh leaves on the forest floor. Upon closer examination, you notice that there are ants in the trees nibbling the stem and dropping the leaf to the ground. Meanwhile, ants in the ground are carving the leaves up into manageable-sized pieces. A long column of ants are marching single file away with a piece of leaf on their back. If you follow them to their mound, you'll see it's the size of a Volkswagen. Inside, ants are cultivating a fungus on the leaves. This fungus is the food that they eat. Leafcutter ants are some of the best gardeners in the world.
As I said, the floor of the rainforest is as hard as the floor in your classroom. If you were to go outside and bring in a tree, let's say an oak or a pine tree, stand it up and let it go, it would fall over. There's nothing to support it. So to cope with that hard, thin soil of the rainforest, trees evolved giant buttress roots 14 feet above ground. Now we could take a chainsaw and go out onto a forest in the United States, cut down a bunch of trees, make a clearing, and plant corn. In a few weeks, we'd have a cornfield started because 80% of the nutrients in our forests are in the soil. Only 20% of the nutrients are tied up in the trees, again, what we call the biomass.
It's just the opposite in the rainforest. 95% of the nutrients are tied up in the trees. The soil in this picture is almost completely sterile. Cut this down, plant corn, well, good luck. Nothing can grow. So settlers burn the rainforest during the dry season and get a few inches of nutrient-rich ash. This is called slash-and-burn agriculture. Then they plant their crops and they grow.
However, the next season they get all that rain. Now, if the canopy were still intact, it takes a long time for the water to percolate, leaf to leaf to leaf. 5 minutes later, it gently dribbles out on the forest floor. If you remove the canopy, the rain now slams directly into the soil, it washes the ash away, and the next year you get this.
In another couple of years, this will look like a desert. Many of you are probably thinking that it's really too bad that they're doing this into the rainforest, but at least it's thousands of miles away from the United States. So we're safe, right? Well, there are plenty of reasons to be concerned. Scientists tell us that planet Earth could be heating up. As gases such as carbon dioxide are released by the burning of fossil fuels like oil and coal, heat from sunlight is trapped, creating a greenhouse effect. It is similar to when sunlight streams through your window and heats your house. The house stays warm after the sun goes down. 1/3 of the gases that could cause global warming come from the burning of the rainforests. They release about 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year as the forests are torched. Although global warming is still a scientific theory, many scientists, including 116 Nobel Prize winners, say we should begin to take steps to prevent it.
Scientists have started running a computer model that shows as the Earth heats up, the size of the oceans could actually increase. This is called thermal expansion. If you take water in a test tube and heat it up, as the temperature increases, so does the volume of water. Well, if you combine thermal expansion of the oceans with melting polar ice caps, the computer says that in as little as 50 to 100 years, the major coastal cities in the United States, New York, Washington, D.C., Miami, New Orleans, Houston, Los Angeles, could have serious flooding problems from rising oceans. Now, if that's a possibility, we don't have to be 100% certain, but if it's a possibility, wouldn't it seem smart to take steps to stop it?
A second reason to be concerned, the rainforests act like giant sponges and contain much of the fresh water that we need for our cities, agriculture, and industry. When the astronauts fly overhead in the space shuttle and look down on the oceans during the rainy season, they see huge clouds forming. These clouds move over the continents and begin to rain. Watching that sponge called the rainforest, they see half the moisture released back into the atmosphere. More clouds form, they move to another part of the forest, and it rains again. That goes on all day. They actually create their own climate. Remove a chunk of the rainforest and you set up the conditions for drought.
Again, this isn't scientific theory. Right now, Quito, Ecuador, Bogota, Colombia, these major cities in the Amazon ration electricity because the rivers are drying up. They can't turn their hydroelectric turbines. And it's interesting to note that Somalia and Ethiopia, where for the last decade we've seen major famines, 50 years ago, famine was not a problem in that part of East Africa when 40% of those countries were covered in forest. They reached down to 1% of the original forest cover. The deforestation is a direct cause of the famine.
Another reason to be concerned, 8 years ago this river was black in color. The reason is that when organic matter such as leaves decompose, they create tannic acid as a byproduct. The rain washed the acid into the river, turning it dark. More importantly, the acids stop the mosquitoes from growing. Now that they've destroyed 80% of the forest in this state, the process is interrupted. The river has cleared up, the mosquitoes are doing quite well, and the people are contracting diseases like malaria. Another reason to be concerned, the concept of biological diversity. 10 years ago, if you'd asked a biologist how many species of plants, animals, and insects there are on the earth, they'd have answered about 3 million. Not anymore. Many of you may have seen the movie Arachnophobia, about a spider that comes to the U.S. with some scientists from the Amazon to wreak havoc. It was an okay movie, but what's really interesting is that it was based on a real story. In the mid-1970s, a scientist named Terry Irwin from the Smithsonian Institute actually went into the Amazon and placed large jars on the forest floor that had funnels going into them. He then began to spray the canopy with a pesticide. It began to rain insects just like in the movie. Terry found one tree had thousands of different species of insects, 80% of which he'd never seen before. That's new, that's new, that's new. It took him 7 months to classify them all. As he came out of his lab, he exclaimed that there are not 3 million species, there must be at least 30 million. Edward O. Wilson from Harvard University found a tree with 43 species of ants. He thinks that the planet has 100 million species. If he's right, the rainforest could contain up to 98% of all terrestrial species.
My favorite time to go out in the rainforest is at night. Many of these creatures are nocturnal. That's the only chance you get to see them. So we put on a raincoat, grab a flashlight, turn it on, sit on a rock or tree stump. Pretty soon bats go flitting around. Occasionally a snake will glide by.
Well, one night it was raining pretty good, and there were frogs hopping everywhere. We filled our pockets with frogs. We filled this big bag with frogs. We got back to the lab and found that we had 7 different kinds of frogs, each one different than the other. Now, if it were to rain in your area for a few days, you could go out at night, walk along the rivers or creeks, and you'd find some frogs. But I doubt that you'd find 7 species. Well, we gathered these from an area the size of 2 football fields. Again, there's much more biodiversity in the rainforest, and some of these creatures are pretty weird. That small red frog, for example, is a poison dart frog. The Indians use them for hunting. They poke a stick through them, roast them in a fire, and catch the poison on a small dart as it comes boiling out of their skin. They load the dart into a blowgun and fire 100 feet into the canopy of the rainforest, knocking down the animals that they used for food. Scientists are learning more about that frog almost daily. One of the things that they recently realized is that he comes in many different colors. However, the brighter the color, the more poisonous he is. That color is an advertisement. You bite me, you die. Well, the snakes, not knowing any better, bite him anyway. The poison is very bitter, and the snake spits him out as quickly as he can. That saves the snake's life, but of course it also saves the frog. Now, as I've said, the brighter the color, the more poisonous he is. This guy is from both Panama and Colombia and has enough toxin in him to kill 50 full-grown men. We call him the Terminator. After finishing with the frogs, we climbed back into the canoe and continued up the river where we encountered this. Now, everything in the rainforest seems to come in one of 2 sizes, large or extra large. These giant lily pads are 12 feet in diameter, big enough to lay on without sinking. You can imagine how big that boa constrictor is. Other snakes use camouflage in its most bizarre form, like this eyelash viper. We get many of our original foods from the rainforest. If we lose the forest, we will lose the genetic material that helps create new, disease-resistant strains of crops. An interesting story about this can be found in Vice President Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance. He explains how close we came to losing rice as a food in the mid-'80s when the wild rice was destroyed along with the rainforest where it came from. We get bananas, citrus fruit, pineapple, papaya, mangoes, coconut, Brazil, cashew, and macadamia nuts. Many of our spices, such as cinnamon for cinnamon rolls, ginger for ginger ale, come from the rainforest. Vanilla for ice cream comes from a stem growing out of an orchid in Mexico's rainforest. And some very important foods that we couldn't live without, chocolate, Coca-Cola, and bubblegum, all depend on a healthy rainforest. For 20 years, we've been saying that you cannot save the rainforest by simply putting up a no trespassing sign. The way to save them is by developing markets for those products that can be harvested sustainably without cutting the trees. Think about it. If your family had a grove of pecan or walnut trees in the yard and every year you picked those nuts and made thousands of dollars, you'd have to be nuts to cut the trees down. Today, many companies are making cereals, cookies, candy bars, juices, etc., which provide an incentive to the people of the forest to not cut the trees. Next time you're in a grocery store, look for products like these. In addition, many of these companies will donate a part of their profits to groups like the Earth Foundation for more rainforest conservation. Up until the 1950s, if a child developed a disease called leukemia, there really wasn't much that doctors could do to help, and it was usually fatal, much like AIDS is today. Today, 80% of the children with leukemia are cured with a medicine from this flower, the rosy periwinkle from the rainforest of Madagascar. In fact, 1 out of every 4 medicines in the United States comes from the rainforest. Many of these drugs were discovered by interviewing shamans who have used flowers, roots, herbs, and other plants for thousands of years to treat disease.
Sadly, scientists tell us that up to 100 species may be going extinct every day, and less than 1 in 100 was tested as a cure for chickenpox, measles, mumps, diabetes, arthritis, cancer, heart disease. In 1987, scientists from the National Institute for Health were in Malaysia. They gathered up plants, took them back to Washington, and ran some tests. One of the trees had a gum that killed HIV in the test tube. Scientists think it may have been a treatment for AIDS. Yet because the country of Malaysia is destroying their rainforest at such an unbelievable rate, the tree may be extinct.
On a lighter note, this is one of the stranger things found in the rainforest, a praying mantis. Here's another unique creature, a 3-toed sloth. Sloths move very slowly and can have up to 7 different kinds of algae grown in its fur, and some have been documented to have more than 900 different species of insects living in their fur. This is a basilisk lizard known for its ability to stand on its hind legs and run across the water when he's scared. Parrots come from the rainforest, in fact too many. About 800,000 were taken annually for the pet trade, 500,000 of which came to the United States. As we stated earlier, the reason the Earth Foundation chose to work with students is that they're willing to do the work. A few years ago, we bombarded the world's airlines with letters and convinced them to no longer carry live birds. If the dealers can't get the birds to market, they can't sell them. This is taking a lot of pressure off the parrots in the wild. Recently, student letters convinced the U.S. Congress to ban the importation of birds. This is really going to make a big difference in saving these magnificent creatures. Writing letters is crucial if we're going to save the rainforests. Earth Foundation works with activists all over the world in developing campaigns and publishes the information in both a regular newsletter and special bulletins. Your teacher will be kept up to date so that you can write letters throughout the year. The second thing that students do to help besides writing letters is raising money. In its first year, the Earth Network of students and teachers raised $5,000 that was donated to the Rare Center for Bird Conservation in the Caribbean.
The Caribbean is where Columbus arrived in 1492, and when he stepped off his ship, he began to keep a diary. On the first day, he says that the sky turned completely black. Not from a storm or a forest fire. Rather, he says that flocks of parrots were so large they blotted out the sun. There must have been millions of parrots. Maybe tens of millions. We know that there were 26 species of Caribbean parrot in 1492. Sadly today, there are only 13 left, with 13 extinct.
In 1977, a scientist named Paul Butler went to study one of the remaining species named after the island where it lived. What Paul found was really disturbing. Only 90 parrots remained. This would be the 14th species to go extinct. One of the reasons was that people actually considered the parrot a delicacy and ate them. Also, they were sold to the tourist trade with no controls at all. But the biggest reason that they were disappearing was that their home, the tropical rainforest, was being destroyed. Now, Paul could have collected his fee and got on the next plane back to England, but he's not like that. Instead, he wrote a questionnaire and asked people on the island what they knew about the rainforest and its wildlife. It turns out that most of them knew almost nothing. So the next thing Paul did was write a book that went into all of the elementary schools. The children got to study the parrot. He hired local people to dress up like parrots, and they gave every student on the island a button with a picture of the parrot. These kids got excited and went home to show their parents what they were learning about the wildlife on their homeland. Then Paul started a marketing program to reach the rest of the adults. He got the brewery to change the label on their national beer to a picture of the parrot. 15,000 bumper stickers were printed by the brewery. Well, there's only 7,000 cars on the island, so each bumper got 2 stickers. And a band on the island recorded a song about the parrots. And since there's only one radio station, the people heard it constantly. Well, it must have worked. By the next year, when Paul went out to do the same questionnaire, 80% of the people on the island were acutely aware of the problems with the parrots. Not only that, they were so proud of their wildlife that they made the parrot the national bird of the island, sort of like our bald eagle. They also established a system of national parks to protect the parrot's habitat. In 1993, those 90 birds were up over 500 in number. Paul has repeated this success story all over the Caribbean islands, saving 4 species of parrot, 1 dove, and a cardinal. This is such an effective program that Earth Foundation's network decided to fund Paul's efforts in Belize. Many of you may have seen the Reebok commercial that had a couple of people running up this temple at Tikal, Guatemala. Well, 700 years ago, there were 13 million Mayan Indians in this area. Think about that, 13 million people. As their population increased, they cut the rainforest to grow more corn and beans. As the soil played out, the Indian population crashed. Today, there are no Mayan Indians left in this region. Overpopulation is the #1 cause of environmental degradation. If we fail to address this problem, all of our conservation efforts will be wasted. Today, there are still people living in the rainforest. These are the Panan of Borneo. Borneo is a beautiful island in the Pacific. Larger than Texas, 10 years ago, it was covered in rainforest. Well, today, 1/3 of the forest is gone. In as little as 10 or 12 years, the rest could go. One has to kind of wonder what right a government official on an island thousands of miles away has to sell this rainforest to a Japanese timber company without ever consulting the people who have been here 40 to 50,000 years. It's simply not fair. So environmentalists and human rights groups put pressure on the governments of Malaysia and Indonesia to save the rainforest. The last reason to be concerned is that 60% of the birds in the United States fly to the rainforest every year. A large percentage of our songbirds, warblers, tanagers, robins, orioles, flycatchers, are disappearing along with the rainforest. This is the golden-cheeked warbler. Down 87%, he's almost extinct. The city of Austin, Texas, where he makes his summer home, is spending millions of dollars to protect his habitat. Unfortunately, chemical companies in the United States continue to export pesticides that are banned here to other countries. DDT, for example, was banned over 20 years ago, yet we're still the world's largest manufacturer of DDT. Malathion is believed partially responsible for the disappearance of this bird. The Earth Foundation and other conservation groups have a plan that addresses the problem of the disappearing birds. Working with environmental groups in the 7 countries of Central America, we are reforesting areas that have been cut, linking up existing forests so that the birds will always have a place to migrate. This idea originated with these 4th graders from the country of Sweden. Located in Northern Europe, Sweden does not have rainforest, but when these students studied the rainforest, they decided to do something about it. They wrote letters and they raised money through bake sales, car washes, etc., and many other schools in Sweden became involved, and when we ran into these kids 3 years later, they had raised $1 million. They bought their own rainforest and add to it every year.
That was the inspiration for the Rainforest Rescue Campaign. And as we've stated, in the first year, students raised $5,000 through the sale of cookies and coin collecting for the Rare Center for Tropical Bird Conservation.
In 1993, artists designed a series of beautiful rainforest t-shirts and the campaign exploded. Over $300,000 was raised for conservation programs by the end of the 1994 school year. Our goal is to raise at least $500,000 each year. In its first 2 years, an area the size of Manhattan has been adopted in Panama through the Nature Conservancy. For every 10 t-shirts that students purchase, the Earth Foundation can save another acre, an area the size of a football field. We also produce videos of the areas where we are working, and each year they are sent to the Earth Network schools. We're also funding local projects that provide alternatives to cutting the forest. This fern, found in Costa Rica, is being planted in the rainforests. As it grows, it can be sold to greenhouses in the United States. If a peasant farmer cuts down the rainforest to raise cattle, they will earn about $7 per year per acre, almost nothing. If, on the other hand, he leaves the rainforest intact and releases baby iguanas, a local delicacy which tastes like chicken, into the forest for later harvesting, he makes over $200 per acre, 30 times more. So Earth Foundation's conservation partner in Panama is now raising over 4,000 iguanas for distribution to farmers. The obvious question at this point is, if it's such a bad idea, why cut them down?
The destruction got started at the end of World War II about 50 years ago. The World Bank was established to take some U.S. tax dollars and loan them to developing countries. The idea was that they'd build roads, bridges, towns would get started, people would get jobs, and then we'd go down there and sell them cars, corn, blue jeans, all the things American businessmen like to export. It really wasn't a bad idea. It was sort of like your parents going to the mall one weekend with a stack of credit cards, but buying too many things. Coming home and saying, wow, how are we going to pay for all this? That's exactly what's happening today. These countries are saying, we've borrowed all this money, how are we going to pay it back?
What they are having to do is cut the rainforest just to pay the interest on the loans. Sometimes people tell environmentalists that they can't tell people not to cut the trees because they need jobs. Well, they don't get many jobs because the timber is exported directly to Japan. It's the Japanese who get most of the jobs because they turn these trees into finished products. Now, we must stress that we are not attacking the people of Japan here. In fact, it's our Japanese friends in Tokyo who have researched this problem. They tell us that the Japanese corporations have been horribly irresponsible at best in the destruction of the rainforest. Not only do they turn these logs into nice furniture, they turn them into at least 1 billion pair of disposable chopsticks that they go through each year. That's enough wood to build 10,000 medium-sized houses. They also use it to make packing crates to send us Mitsubishis and Sonys. 50 years ago, the Philippine Islands were covered in rainforest. Well, today, because of the Japanese companies, only 3% remains. In 1991, a typhoon hit the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, and because the forest was gone, the rainwater came cascading out of the mountains, picked up a village, and flung it into the ocean. 15,000 people drowned, just so Japan could have packing crates and chopsticks. Once the forest is gone, they try to grow crops. Coffee plantations here are failing after just 3 years. Well, it takes coffee 7 years to produce berries. No one ever earns a penny from it. This pasture used to be a rainforest. In Central America, where our birds migrate, the largest cause of deforestation is cattle ranching. Now, cattle ranching works pretty good in Texas and Montana, where cattle basically replace buffalo as part of the ecosystem, but they're not native to the rainforest. And cattle hooves wave so much that after 5 to 7 years of grazing, the soil is compacted to look like this. Nothing will ever grow here again. In 1987, the Rainforest Action Network began an investigation to find out who was buying the millions of pounds of beef exported from these countries every year. It turned out to be the fast food industry in the United States. Burger King was the biggest purchaser of all. And when environmentalists explained that the continued purchase of beef from Central America could destroy the remainder of the rainforests, Burger King officials refused to consider a different source for meat. As articles were published, students spontaneously boycotted and cost Burger King 20% of their sales worldwide. By 1988, they canceled $35 million in meat orders with Costa Rica.
Recently, Burger King told Norway to cancel the fish order. Norway started whaling again. What's interesting is environmentalists didn't ask Burger King to do that. This is a corporation that's come around to the other side of the environmental issue based on one thing, a concern for their young consumers' opinion. You students spend $75 billion a year into the U.S. economy, and you have a right to know where that money goes, as well as a responsibility to do business with earth-friendly companies.
Then environmental activists took on the World Bank, the source of loans for so many projects in the rainforest. The bank refused to respond, so this banner was hung from their office in Washington, D.C. Remember, it was U.S. tax dollars run through that bank that funded projects like this hydroelectric dam. The environmental issue aside, many of these projects did not make economic sense. The cost of the electricity was many times more than if appropriate technology had been used. And the environmental costs were tremendous. This forest wasn't even logged. As the lake rose, the wood decomposed, forming methane gas, a very potent greenhouse gas. The wildlife, of course, is also gone. Because of the pressure on the U.S. Congress, the World Bank has stated that they will no longer fund certain projects in the rainforests. But given the bank's preference for large, costly projects, many environmentalists believe that the bank can never be reformed and should be closed. The point is that U.S. citizens and students, by writing letters, are making a difference. In Costa Rica, the large banana producers have acquired the land along the rivers that enter the Caribbean Sea. In spite of Costa Rican law that requires a 33-foot strip of forest be retained along the river, the companies have clear-cut to the edge. They're growing bananas and periodically spray them with pesticides. The rain washes the pesticide into the river, which are then flushed into the Caribbean and poison the coral reef. Scientists now think the reef cannot recover. We are encouraging these corporations to replant trees and cut back on pesticides. And if they'll do so, their bananas will get an Eco-OK sticker for U.S. consumers to recognize in the grocery store. But if they won't do that, then maybe we should consider strawberries on our cereal in the morning. Playful river otters like this one cannot survive in polluted rivers. Beautiful ocelots are some of the things that we stand to lose. Same with 18-foot crocodiles. Unfortunately, it's not just the Japanese and banana companies. This is an oil production facility in the Amazon. This is not water, it's oil, sitting in an unlined pit, and it will seep into the water table, poisoning it for many miles. If we don't allow this in the United States, why in the world would we allow it in the Amazon? This is Rafael Pandam, a Shuar Indian chief and head of Kawika. Native people like Rafael are coming to the United States to ask for our help in stopping the companies that are damaging their rainforest homes. Kawika is an indigenous peoples group in Ecuador that is fighting to keep polluting companies out of the Amazon. These Panan came out of the rainforest of Borneo out of desperation. The chainsaws and bulldozers had driven the game away. They were starving. For 7 months, they blockaded the road, keeping the timber companies out. But because corrupt Malaysian government officials make so much money from the timber, they sent in the army, driving them back into the forest. The logging not only started again, they now run their sawmills 24 hours a day under massive floodlights. And the company that owns the timber is the Mitsubishi Corporation of Japan, one of the world's largest destroyers of forests. There's a worldwide boycott of their cars, televisions, computers, etc. by environmental activists. According to Japanese environmentalists, the only way they will stop the logging is if they lose enough sales in the United States. With half the world's rainforests gone, it is important that the richer countries provide assistance for reforestation. This experimental plot utilizes a plant that puts nitrogen back in the soil so that coffee and bananas can be grown year after year without destroying the soil itself. The wood can also be used by the women in their cook stoves. Imagine that you live in Africa. In some countries, your mom would spend half her day, every day, just looking for wood to cook with. The Earth Foundation is funding many reforestation projects, but it is critical that the U.S., Europe, and Japanese governments get more involved. We've got to start planting trees. This young man is an Imbira Indian in Panama. The plants are rainforest hardwood species that will eventually be transplanted. Once they reach about 3 feet, they'll be carried to deforested sites for reforestation. The money that your school raises through the T-shirt campaign and other means will allow us to continue our efforts to replant large areas in Central America where our neotropical migrant birds spend their winter. At this point, hopefully many of you would like to visit a rainforest. This sign in Costa Rica advertises in English to the many Americans who visit the rainforest every year. If we go down and spend money in the hotels and restaurants, it's another incentive to not cut it down. Every year, students and teachers accompany the Earth Foundation on trips to the rainforest. Exploring these ecosystems is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for middle school and high school students as well as teachers. This is one of our stops, Radavis. With a double waterfall, it makes for great swimming. If you're interested in a summer program, please contact the Earth Foundation as soon as possible, as these eco-study programs fill very quickly. If you cannot visit a rainforest, many arboretums, museums, etc. have constructed miniature rainforests in the United States. Here you see the famous rainforest pyramid at Moody Gardens in Galveston, Texas. Earth Foundation works closely with such institutions to offer teacher-in services.
It's important that you understand that environmentalists are not advocating turning the rainforest into giant parks. They're often accused of that by industry and foreign governments. We fully understand that these countries are poor, they have exploding populations, they need jobs, and they're going to use their resources, including the rainforest. We can't stop that. But we also have sophisticated models now that show that the rainforest is worth a lot more if you leave it intact and you harvest what's out there. Dyes, lubricants, medicinal plants, ornamental plants, set up ecotourism, etc.
If you're wearing sneakers, came to school in a car, play basketball, etc., thank a rubber tapper for going into the Amazon to harvest latex without destroying the forest. That's the way to save them, by using them sustainably. Today, the eyes of nature are upon all of us. We must decide, will we leave space for the great creatures of the forest, or will they only be found in zoos because we failed to act? These playful bears cannot wait much longer for our answer. This jaguar, ever so elusive, has a beauty unseen by many, but he can't hide from the poachers forever. This pink dolphin is one of only 2 species of dolphin to adapt to freshwater river environments. His ecosystem needs him. He represents millions of years of evolution going up in smoke every day. Once in plentiful population all through the Americas, the cougar is now losing the battle in the rainforest. The gorillas have been helped by setting up ecotourism in Africa. The golden lion tamarin was once thought to be extinct in the wild. The tamarin is now being reintroduced to the forest through the breeding programs of many zoos. But the orangutans may not be so lucky. At the rate Mitsubishi and other companies are destroying Borneo, they could be gone in just a few years. Are we going to allow this to continue to happen? Or do you prefer this? We can save the rainforest, but each one of us must do our part.